Speaking of that and these current protests, I've heard people say that, there's basically no hope for China. People are so brainwashed. They're just all nationalistic little pinks. But I always disagreed with that because I feel like we just don't know. I imagine there was a lot of resentment against the Chinese Communist Party sort of simmering under the surface, and there's no way to really show it. But these protests, I think, really have demonstrated that is the case. It's like not all of Chinese society is not brainwashed. They know what's going on. Like we saw not just Bridgeman, but the response to Bridgeman. How many people, and especially Chinese people around the world, started posting those messages, or in China spreading those messages in the toilet revolution because they could put his messages up in toilets since there was no surveillance in there, hopefully. But then with these protests, we saw people saying, Xi Jinping stepped down, CCP stepped down. Like that was not even something that was said during Tiananmen Square. Like they were calling
for the very end.
Yeah. They were mostly calling for just like really modest political reform.
It didn't turn into a pro-democracy protest until like in the last weeks of Tiananmen Square.
Yeah. So, I mean, this just really shows that there's a lot going on in Chinese society that because of internet's surveillance and censorship, there's a lot more resistance to the CCP than I think a lot of people expected.
Remember what Chen Guangcheng said to you like 3 years ago, Shelley?
Yes. The Chen Guangcheng, the blind Chinese activist. He had gotten in trouble in China for trying to defend women who had forced abortions. And then he had been put under house arrest, escaped house arrest while blind, and made it all the way up to Beijing, and then made it to the U.S. embassy in Beijing, and then the U.S. got him out of China. We interviewed him in 2019, and he talked about how the perception of how Chinese people feel about the CCP is not true. Like exactly what you were talking about, that like the CCP wants everybody to think that like everybody supports them, and you might get like a mistaken view if you look at some of the more nationalistic young people who are outside of China because a lot of their parents' money came from the CCP, that kind of corruption. But he said inside China, there are so many people who are very against the CCP.
They just don't post about it online because they know they can't.
Yeah. And also because of the mistrust, like communist systems always make people fear and mistrust and hate each other. So I know what a lot of people were saying, like after the Bridgeman, is like for them that was a moment of like, oh my gosh, there are so many other people who think like I do. Like suddenly they understood like, oh, I'm not the only dissident. And I think these protests are going to be a big part of that. And I think what's interesting too is, the Communist Party, their playbook is always to say, oh, these are just hostile foreign forces. And there was that one video we posted on our Twitter account of, like somebody like telling the protest, oh, young people don't be, misled by these hostile foreign forces.
It was another young person. The full video was like this young guy who's in the middle of the protest, and he's like, there are anti-Chinese forces, foreign forces around us right now. And like people just weren't buying it.
Yeah, and like I think one person was like, hostile foreign forces, what about Marx and Engels?
They were like, what foreign forces are you talking about? Are you talking about Marx? Are you talking about Lenin, Stalin? And then there was like a huge kind of protest around, like then all the protesters were yelling about things like, we can't even access the foreign internet. We can't leave the country. How are these foreign forces supposed to, how are they supposed to contact us? Like it was, and I like the guy there was a guy who's like, where are the foreign forces coming from? And then this guy yells, the moon. Like it's just, sense of humor and like a sense of like that even the Chinese people themselves think the hostile foreign forces thing is just like BS.
Well, the foreign forces can't come from the moon because, as we know, the moon has been part of Chinese territory since ancient times.
Yeah, thank you, Chang'e. But yeah, so that was a great video, and it's also in our headlines episode from Friday.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think it does show that Chinese people, a lot of these protests were led by students. That are the zero COVID policy had a big effect, I think, in kind of waking a lot of people up.
Yeah. On top of the, youth unemployment and all, just the hopelessness of young people in China today.
So supposedly Xi Jinping told he had met with some European officials in Beijing on Friday, and according to comments from the European officials, Xi Jinping told them that the protests were, mostly a lot of frustrated students, and that they were just sick of COVID after a few years.
Right. And,
So,
and if you're upset about a virus, what you do is you go out and protest the virus.
well, and then he said something about how Omicron is less lethal than previous versions of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And so these European officials are interpreting that as China is going to loosen its zero COVID policy.
That message is being pushed so much.
Well, there's actually some really interesting things that we can see that mean it might be happening. But like Xi Jinping saying this to European officials, of course the European officials want to believe this also because like they want to do business in China and
because their economies are dying.
Yeah, they were
too.
basically telling Xi Jinping like you got to push vaccinations. This is killing us. And then she was like, oh well, I hear Omicron is less lethal, and
He's like, it's killing you.
Yeah, I mean, I think if China starts to loosen the zero COVID policy, I think the protests are going to be a big part of it. But I think the bigger thing is definitely the economic devastation that's happening that the CCP is desperately trying to keep under wraps. So I think that is ultimately the reason for the zero COVID turnaround is not like the protests, like they don't want that to go too far. They don't want like a nationwide uprising in any sense.
Yeah.
But they could control that if they wanted to. The bigger issue is the economy.
Like cities are going bankrupt. But it's not just the lack of production happening. It's also that maintaining zero COVID is very expensive because you have to have government funded, dabai, like the people in the hazmat suits enforcing policy.
They're all migrant workers.
And the COVID's testing. And, when a city has to do 10 million tests a day, like just the expense of this is just outlandish, and it's not productive.
Earlier, we talked about the idea that, once the Communist Party builds these systems, they don't just go away.
It's going to be hard for them to go away. But the other thing is, like, there's been a lot of pushback for a long time of like an argument between the central government and local governments over who has to pay for the PCR tests and stuff like that, because people aren't paying right now.
That communist credit card.
So that is one of the issues, is that like the system is expensive to maintain. But if you dismantle the system, what are going to happen to all the people who have been working as these COVID workers, right? Like the dabai, like they don't have jobs anymore.
All the factories that manufacture all the COVID tests and stuff.
The equipment, the tests, even like the dabai uniforms, the masks. Then you have things like, there's this whole surveillance system with all of these like QR
COVID
code, COVID apps. What are you going to do with those? Like there's a bunch of things to consider.
And I bet a lot of Communist Party officials themselves are invested in these companies. So they have power to make sure they don't go away.
Yeah, there's a lot of rumors spreading around the Chinese internet right now about corruption involving the PCR tests and PCR test companies.
Yep. Which is more of the wonderful legacy of that intelligent, joyful man. He was intelligent and joyful.
Yes.
According to that. If you're on Twitter, maybe send Dianne Feinstein a nice little response to that.
Oh my gosh. Oh, she is totally so bought off. But yeah, so but like I do think that as cynical as we are about zero COVID ever being stopped, there are some things that are happening that indicate it could be happening soon. But like I don't think they're going to lift it all at once. It's going to be this gradual rollout. Like it's starting with the propaganda, where People's Daily started suddenly posting articles about how COVID isn't as dangerous. Like, Omicron doesn't seem to be as dangerous. Like a few months ago, they had an article about how long COVID was going to devastate the West. And then now there's an article that's like, long COVID doesn't exist.
I mean, it's disgusting to see newspapers and media just parroting the recommendations of government and politician without independent thought. I could not imagine living in a country like that.
Well, I mean, this is a little different than just parroting, right? This is actual like this is from the CCP. This is the People's
Specifically.
Daily. It is the mouthpiece of the CCP. But so there's some of that. There's like photos started flying on the Chinese internet of some PCR booths being taken down or taken away. Like the sign being taken down about COVID testing being required at like an airport. Like, so people are very like hopeful right now that this is what's happening.
I mean, Xi Jinping's third term is really off to an eventful start.
Yeah, wasn't it? Didn't you say like Sun Chunlan, who is the COVID czar essentially? She also said something about how like Omicron isn't as dangerous. You know
Yeah.
what?
So you said it. So when even the COVID czar is starting to say that things aren't as risky as before, like basically the Communist Party at some point has to back down from zero COVID, but they also want to save face.
Yeah, they won't admit there was anything wrong.
Right. They never did anything wrong, but also now there's an excuse why the policy is changing.
Their circumstances are changing. That's all.
Right.
Like the CCP kept everyone safe this whole time from COVID.
Until Omicron was no longer as dangerous as the original.
They
and
won
so-
the war on COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll have to see how this goes. But like there are actual signs that like they're starting to back down. Unlike a few weeks ago when like the stock markets all went up because they thought that was going to happen,
Yeah.
and then more lockdowns happened.
Yeah, but now, Shelley, now is the time to invest in China.
Well, also I hear that like Beijing is basically under lockdown. They do fun things with language of like they're not locking down a city. They just lock down all the apartment blocks in a city.
Yeah, I mean that's what they were doing essentially. Then the protests happened.
Yeah, but no, even still, this past week.
I mean, I think that like that's another thing to keep an eye on. But I think Chinese people are very aware of this now. So it'll be much harder for them to get away with the whole thing of saying it's not a lockdown. It is dynamic management, or like a lot of these
Whatever
other
BS words.
euphemisms they come up with to describe it. But some places in, I forget, it was Shanghai or Guangzhou, they started taking the barriers down outside of apartment buildings because that's like a visible representation of the lockdown. So they're like, okay, we're going to get rid of these, but it doesn't necessarily mean that like everybody's going to be free to move around all the time. And we'll have to see what happens after a couple of weeks from now.
And what parts of the system still remain?
I just had a terrifying thought. You know what system has been created during the last 3 years of COVID? Giant quarantine camps all over the country. What could those be used for after COVID?
I'm sure they're just going to take them down.
Yeah, you're probably right. Well,
I guess it depends what happens if there are more protests. One of the things that is happening is that the government is promising that people don't have to be taken to the quarantine camps anymore if they are a close contact.
Yeah,
or something like that.
I think I saw something about like a quarantine camp got burned down.
There is footage that claims to be of a quarantine camp burning. I forget where, somewhere in Western China, I think. But it is not clear when that happened. It is not clear if that was like a protest-related thing, or like there's just not enough context from the footage.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're always very careful about like what kind of video we post because like I've seen so many people over the years like share footage of like, oh, the tanks are rolling in, and it could be just like tanks going from one place to another at any point in the past like 5-10 years.
That happened a lot in Hong Kong too, where people kept being like, the tanks are rolling in, and it was not.
It was not true.
It was not true. Yeah. So it is very tough. And I have a suspicion that it will become harder as the CCP tries to do things like clamp down on VPNs, which they are.
Yep.
To verify some of this footage. So.
Yep. Well, so stay tuned for updates from us on everything that's happening in China. This is a very exciting time that's happening. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We post a lot of stuff there that doesn't make it onto the shows always, especially videos and photos.